The Carter-Jenkins Center will present a lecture tonight on the subject of the contributions of sight to the development of the ego and the instincts and we'll cover too the problems that some blind people born blind at birth have in development. The lecture is based on research that was done years ago at the Anna Freud Clinic in London, where I was a staff member. And the clinic had, among the many projects, one on blind children that were born that way. And it was a blind nursery school where a group of children were coming every day and were being observed and studied carefully, and some research was being done. At the time, this was a favorite, a pet project of Dorothy Burlingham and some of the other people at the clinic. And as you will see, is, as I think, an interesting problem that can be of very useful when dealing with such unfortunate human beings. Speaking now very generally, we have had the opportunity to observe two very different possibilities of development among children who are born blind, and we include here as well children who have or may have become blind very early on in life, perhaps soon after birth. In a small number of such cases, the development, in spite of the blindness, does not seem to lag much behind the development of sighted children. The ego processes that drive development, their object relationships, are not too far behind those of the sighted children of similar ages. In another very distinct group, one finds blind children whose development processes are atypical and depart significantly in many ways from the norm, as we will try to describe to you. They lag behind in different degrees in different areas of development, giving in some extreme cases the impression of a marked mental retardation, though they may not be mentally retarded. These two types are, of course, the two extremes on a scale with all sorts of possible combinations exist in between. The cases that we are referring to here belong mostly in the second group, that is, those that have difficulties. And they show specific clinical and developmental pictures which they have in common with many other blind born, but which is by no means representative of the development possibilities of all blind born children. As I said, some of them seem to do it pretty close to normality. Indeed, the clinic had as well at this project for children that generally were between the ages of 3.5 and 8 in the blind nursery, a research project studying blind adults that have been very successful trying to understand what factors were significant in their ability to overcome what is in many cases a very significant and marked developmental interference, the lack of sight. And we did study many such patients, thinking that by finding out what were the conditions under which they were able to develop that well, we could help those children that were having difficulties. We believe that the study of different groups of children born blind may teach us a great deal about how some overcome their handicap to a degree that brings them closer to the level of the sighted. Even when the blind grows up under the most favorable circumstances, which are rarely encountered in terms of ego endowment, good early mothering, reasonable environmental conditions, favorable object relationships, etc. There is a point at which the development of one or another ego function clearly requires a contribution from the side of vision. And if that contribution is not available, there is a problem. When that contribution, as I said, is not available, then a disruption in the development of a specific functions ensues. In turn, the insufficiency of these functions or of other aspects of the ego leads to further developmental interferences in all areas in which such functions are a necessary prerequisite. It seemed to us that this state of affairs can be somewhat alleviated by the environment, its handling of an attitude to the blind and to the problems of the growing blind child. It can make a positive contribution to the blind child's development by teaching alternative ways to deal with the problems where they have difficulties given the lack of sight. And so they can be taught directly and at the right point the suitable alternative means of compensating for that lack of sight. Left to itself, the ego of the blind may never achieve this or only do so through long and painful detours, and at much later stages. It may well be that some of the difference in development of the two groups of blind we are describing are related to these very factors. Thus, the observation of the means by which in the blind child's ego finds alternative solution can give us clues to the kind of teaching and handling required at the different developmental stages and points at which help may be needed to stimulate further development in a positive way. In our study, we have made very special effort to single out those aspects of development and personality which are specific to blind children in which they differ from the sighted children. In this way, we were hoping in time to be able to understand the nature of the contribution of sight to normal ego development and how much blindness can distort that development. And that's by way of an introduction to the subject. Now let's look at the drive development, and both of the libidinal development and the aggression, the development of the aggressive drive in the children. And in some cases that you will see somewhat interesting. Incidentally, this is a short version of a much longer paper that I published in my book entitled The Developmental Approach to Childhood Psychopathology. And if you are interested in the subject, there is a much more extensive review in that particular article. In terms of the drive development, the libidinal development, all the cases that we studied, and remember they were of this second group that have difficulties, not of the type of child that may, in spite of blindness, become normal. Incidentally, the blindness may have been caused by a different number of medical problems. And there was, many years ago, as you know, with premature babies, there was a tendency to place them in hyperbaric chambers and with high concentration of oxygen. And for a while this led to blindness in a large number of cases until it was understood what the problem was. And then that was stopped. But all the cases that we have studied show that the blind develop in this area at a much more slower pace than the sighted child. Even more striking, perhaps, is the lack that this group of blind children, in marked contrast to the sighted ones, seem incapable of leaving behind, and this is important, the previous phases when a new developmental move occurs. The move into the phallic-oedipal phase does not at all imply that dry gratification and autoerotic activities pertaining to the anal and to the oral phase will tend to disappear or even to recede notably into the background. On the contrary, marked activity of the anal and oral stages is always observed simultaneously. It's as if no phase is left completely behind, and there are manifestations of all the phases all the way through. So there is, as I said, a marked activity of the anal and oral stages, which is always observed simultaneously with the newly found phallic-oedipal forms of dry gratification. It may perhaps be concluded that blindness can so much interfere with finding new means of gratification, both in drive discharge and ego activities, that any form of gratification once experienced is not easily abandoned or left behind, even when further developmental steps are taken by the blind child. All earlier forms of gratification remain egosyntonic frequently. And we shall come back to this point. Now, in terms of the aggressive drive, Of course, there are significant variations in the forms of expression of the aggressive drive in these children. We form the impression that these blind children show a tendency to inhibit, generally speaking, any form of overt expression of aggression against those objects on whom they are dependent. The fact that they do inhibit aggression in this specific way may not be apparent to the casual observer, who may easily gain the impression that the children's behavior is quite aggressive. This misunderstanding of the real circumstances is due to two factors. First, many of these blind children are still largely at the anal sadistic stage of libido development. Some are, for example, fully at the anal sadistic stage and behave accordingly. It is true that descriptively, i.e. to an observer, behavior of this type may seem extremely aggressive, but it's not that they are particularly aggressive at that particular point in their life, is that the drive development is well behind. And another child, or another question that we did observe is the fact that the child's relationship with other children may be somewhat different. In one of the children's case, a little girl called Winnie, one should have taken into consideration that on the line of development from egocentricity to companionship, she had not yet developed any empathy for other children. In other words, that development was enormously delayed. So, not having developed any empathy for other children's feelings, then they can express very freely their strong ambivalent feelings, which at times come to the surface. This type of aggressive behavior, though, must be distinguished from the later forms where the aggressive act is carried out with full awareness of its effect on the other child. In this way, many blind children show a marked inhibition of the expression of aggression, and this is due partly to the fear of losing the favor and love of the object, those that take care of the children, as we mentioned a moment ago, a fear that is immediately transformed into a fear of annihilation caused by the extreme dependence on objects for reasons of safety. In the case of Winnie, that we referred a moment ago, we noted that it was important for her to hear the result of her aggressive actions, given that she couldn't see it. Breaking object, glass, etc. But we have not been able to confirm that this applies generally to all other blind children, but in her case, this was important. She brought things to identify the noise that produced. Some instances of very disturbed behavior, which take place in moments of regression, provoked by current difficulties at home, in school, and so on, may be wrongly interpreted as object-directed aggression. In fact, some of these manifestations are panic reactions of an overwhelmed ego, They lead to disorganized behavior and other primitive expression of the infant stage, such as crying, throwing things at random, and so on. Now, in terms of the cathexis of the self, we should talk a little bit about the self-esteem regulation. In this area, our group of blind children differs significantly from normally sighted children in that the blind have a more marked and presumably longer period of dependence on the external world in order to maintain the cathexis of themselves at a level that is compatible with their well-being. In many of the children we have studied and observed in our nursery for the blind, this extreme dependence upon the object world is further shown in an inability to maintain their own self-esteem and cathexis of the self when the object world withdraws the cathexis from them. In other words, if the objects on which they were dependent were angry with the child withdrew the cathexis from them for any reason, these children were essentially devastated. In terms of the cathexis of objects, it seems clear from our observations that even apparently retarded blind children can reach object constancy and can relate to the object world on that level of object constancy, though they may seem pretty retarded in other ways. On the other hand, they may not completely leave behind the other phases and will sometimes relate to and use the objects on a fulfilling basis as well. Indeed, they tend to move forward and backward from the one to the other phase quite frequently. They sometimes give the impression that they readily and easily exchange objects, even for unfamiliar ones, as if object constancy had not been properly achieved by them. But a more careful examination of the facts will support the view that owing to the lack of sight, the blind child experiences extreme anxiety when someone is not nearby to protect them. The blind child, fully aware through experience of the very many dangers that exist around him and of his inability to care for himself in the absence of a protective object, tends to cling to anyone present when the familiar or dearest objects are, for whatever reason, not available. And in that way, they seem sort of promiscuous. But this is the reason for it. So, it is presumably this attitude which in fact serves self-preservation that leads to the false impression that some blind children are not attached appropriately to their objects on the level of object constancy. But a closer observation shows that this is the case. But this is one of the situations in which the lack of sight interferes with the ego ability to predict what is going to happen, what is the danger, what is going on, and so on. We have noted as well that the blind group that we studied shows a strong tendency to comply with the wishes of the important objects and especially with those of the mother. It's carried to extremes that are hardly observable in sighted children of the same age. And that gives you some kind of idea of what happens to the cathexis of self and the cathexis of object. Okay, now we are going to discuss the ego of the blind. And first of all, we should discuss some general considerations. The consistent and systematic study of the personality of a number of blind children by means of the application of the developmental profile and Freud's developmental profile forces us to conclude that there is an unwarranted readiness to interpret the peculiarities of behavior, fantasies, and symptoms, and so on, in the same light and on the same basis as those of sighted, normal, or neurotic children. Thus, we proceed in our assessment as if the blind child were ordinary children, except for their lack of sight. This may be so when the loss of sight has taken place later in the child's life, when his development in every possible direction may have been fairly well advanced. Clearly, when the child's lack of sight dates from birth or early babyhood, drive and ego development proceeds in atypical and distorted ways. The correlations valid for the sighted between surface behavioral material and depth unconscious determinants and meanings are not directly applicable to the blind. Many of the pointers, indicators, clinical evaluations, and so on which we can rely with a fair degree of certainty in assessing the sighted child's personality and neurotic conflicts, are unreliable instruments in the evaluation of the blind. And this is important and not frequently taken into consideration. Now let's look now at the fear of animals and the reason for it. This is a significant factor. In many of the blind children that we have observed, they tend to show a very marked fear of animal noises. Both animals and noises. One of them, one of the children that we have there, but this is common to many, particularly fear dogs, horses, birds, and other noises. Another was very frightened of thunder, of rain, wind, trains, making, the normal noises of a train, drilling machines, dogs barking, etc. When these fears take place inside the children of a comparable age, they can be taken as a sure indication of an area of disturbance, of a specific conflict or clear defense activity and symptom formation. In the sighted child of a given age, the presence of fear or phobic avoidance of certain animals, such as birds or horses or dogs, entitle us to assume that the animal stands for the Oedipal rival and that the fear of being attacked by it is the result of the child projecting his own aggressive feelings onto the hated rival. In the case of the blind, it is frequently very difficult to determine how much of the above behavioral symptomatology is the result of defense activity against the drive, that is, the result of conflict and how much is in fact appropriate adaptive behavior in terms of survival in a child who lacks vision. Here, one has to remind oneself that when a blind child hears a barking dog, he cannot see whether the dog is big or small, whether it's being playful or hostile, whether it intends to bite or to play. And these are the reasons, of course, for this marked fear. The next point is the enormous clinging and dependence that they show on objects. And here the same viewpoint applies to the blind child's unusual degree of clinging to and dependence on the object at an age when he will normally be expected to have outgrown this type of relationship. In the sighted of the same age, such clinging constitutes a clear indication either of important fixation points at the oral level or of defense activity directed against certain specific conflict situations. In the blind, this extreme clinging and dependence, as already mentioned, are characteristic for a long period of life. Rather than being the result of defense activity, they are, or may be, another sign of the complex pattern of ego adaptation to a sighted world. The next point will be the frequent withdrawal into fantasy and passivity, which is characteristic of the blind. And this is something that can be understood in a similar way to what we have been describing. The sighted adult who has learned to cope with the ordinary conditions of his immediate environment experiences fear of reality only in the face of true danger situations. For him, it is practically impossible to imagine the state of extreme helplessness and anxiety of the blind child, for whom a great deal of the external world represents dangers that he is still ill-equipped to master. The blind child is obviously swamped by constant waves of anxiety derived from an unending variety of occurrences which are incompletely understood or wrongly interpreted. The next point refers to the state of permanent alertness to external dangers, which seems to occupy the child's mind to a degree which outweighs the importance of the internal dangers represented by the impulses and other drive representative. Compared with the dreaded hazards of the environment, the inner world is a source of safety and gratification to the blind child. It is a combination of factors: fear of the external, retreat of the internal world, which may explain the marked delay in the mastery and control of drive activity which we observe in our blind children. On the other hand, the children's fantasy lives seem extremely limited in comparison with the richness of imagination and fantasy production of the sighted, either normal or neurotic child of similar ages, a fact which may be due, of course, to the comparatively low level of ego development of the group of children that we are describing. Though, as we mentioned earlier, there is a tendency to withdraw into some kind of fantasy life and passivity. Fantasy production, as a well-known pre-stage of neurotic symptom formation in children and adults, usually represent the withdrawal from unpleasant external reality which interfere with processes of dry gratification in the blind. The blind children, in spite of the most unpleasant external reality, cannot afford to withdraw from it. Only constant surveillance with the alternative senses at their disposal will avoid unpleasant, hurtful experiences. Consequently, many of the mental activities consist of attempt to master through repetition and in imagination the many painful situations which they have experienced. In Birmingham paper of 1964, she had pointed to a piece of behavior that is often misleading in the blind. To the casual observer, the blind children frequently appear to be fully withdrawn into passivity when in fact behind this facade, says Ms. Burlingham, there is an extremely active listening and a close attention to what goes on in the environment. They are trying to hear, which is an alternative way of getting information for the blind. No less important, though, is the fact that we already mentioned that the blind child allows himself a great deal of direct dry gratification, which may make the function of fantasy a lot less vital for him at times. Let's talk now of the unreliability of the ego functions. As regards the development of certain ego functions in the blind, it is important to note that the ego performance can be extremely unreliable, even in cases of reasonably well-established functions in these children. Most important in this respect is the ease with which anxiety can become overwhelming and traumatic and result in the temporary collapse of otherwise well-established and quasi-normal ego functions. Thus, it was frequently observed by us that when in distress, danger, or in extreme anxiety situation, many of these children would become immobile. Sometimes they become immobile to the extreme of looking rigid. This immobility may well be a learned response very early. They learn this very early in order to protect themselves from further pain, damage, or dangers. Remember, sight is an incredible source of information that they are lacking. So, let's talk now about the immobility of blind children. We observe as well when they were introduced to a new environment that they were rather unable to move around. They were showing immobility. For a child, while they tended to remain very still, not to move, in order to get oriented, perceiving and collecting as much information as possible through the appropriate sense organ, in their case, obviously, especially the hearing. In terms of walking, in the case that we studied, walking started at any time between 13 months and 3 years, which was quite delayed. The parental attitude to the child in this regard was a significant factor in connection with this function. Remember that many of the parents of these children carry an enormous sense of guilt and enormous fear that they can be damaged and consequently are extremely overprotective. One child that we observed started walking at 13 months. He didn't crawl, but used to turn around and round on her behind, and then she pulled herself up. The father of the child used to help her by walking alongside her, and so he promoted the walking, which of course is difficult otherwise. Another child began walking at 18 months without previous crawling. She was given a large doll to touch, and in this way began to walk. Another one, called George, walked by 20 months. John had 2 years without having ever crawled before. This was common. While Janet did not sit up until she was 2 years of age, crawl at 2.5 years of age, and walk at 3 years of age, which was quite late. Let me talk a little bit about how the blind child uses ego functions in the service of adaptation to the world around him. Winnie, that we have referred to already, rely on other sensory modalities to orient herself in and explore the environment and for her own stimulation. Her reliance on tactile sensation was very large. That is, feeling the bumps on the window pane, stroking a new object with her cheek, sometimes they mouth objects. She also used her head as a drum, knocking an object against her temples, which would seem to involve both tactile and auditory sensation, and she got information in this particular way. She enjoyed being barefooted and explored her environment in this way with her feet, which incidentally is not uncommon, as we will see in a moment. Her awareness of surfaces was seen in her recognition of certain streets with cobblestones, so that when she was going out for a walk, she sometimes knew where she was, given what the surface of the sidewalk felt like. Her hearing was most acute. She would aim objects correctly at the therapist when she wanted to throw them. She knew exactly where the therapist was through hearing. She felt more at ease when she heard the therapist knitting, and thus was assured of her awake presence. She derived much pleasure from hearing the sound of glass breaking, that she frequently did. She would knock two objects together and listen to the sound. In other words, she was exploring a whole world of sounds. Smell was also important to her. She could locate the local bakery by means of the smell. Smell was at the same time sexualized, as can be seen in her request to the therapist. "Come, smell my funny." Throughout the treatment, she often sought close physical contact by sitting on the therapist's lap and asking for love, which suggests that the total surface of her body was a major receptor for stimulation. Helen showed and may use a very well-developed sense of hearing. This child, Helen, was able to tell when the paper boy was coming down the road long before her mother could hear him. She was also clearly attracted to her mother's powder and scents. George, another child, compensated for his lack of vision mainly by means of auditory and tactile sensorial experiences. In addition, testing things, mouthing, and licking very frequently in blind children were used by him when he was 5 years old in a manner similar to the ways of a sighted toddler, only that he was several years past that stage. In terms of the use of memory, memory seems to serve the blind very well. In practically all the cases we studied and many others observed, this function shows itself as very adequate and helpful. Not infrequently, it served purposes of orientation as shown in Winnie's trip with her therapist to the local shops. Scenes recalled for such purposes were memories of smell experiences, of noises heard, of texture, of surfaces felt on her feet, cobblestone surfaces, for example. Now let's now look at language. This is really an interesting issue. Contact with the object world through word plays a particularly important role in the blind, obviously. In the cases that we studied, the acquisition of a speech was hardly ever precociously developed, and the timetable for the beginning of talking ranged roughly from 18 months to 3 years of age. George began talking at 18 months. Helen was fairly fluent by 2.5 years. Winnie was talking by 2 years. Janet talked when she was 3 years. It is a well-established fact that certain forms of thinking and the development of certain other ego functions are dependent largely on the acquisition of a proper imagery and of adequate symbols on the basis of which thought processes of an ever-increasing complexity and quality are possible. The synthetic and integrative function of the ego are very dependent in everybody on the intactness of these processes, which are essential for the proper understanding and mastery of the world around us, making further ego development possible on that basis. It is likewise well established that words are the essential units that require symbols on the basis of which the above-mentioned processes can take place. Quite clearly, whatever interferes with the child's ability to acquire such symbols may bring aspects of his ego development to a near standstill and be responsible for sometimes creating the impression of extreme backwardness. Extreme examples of such cases can be observed in children with congenital deafness. When they are taught to lip read and to talk, dramatic improvements often take place in their ego development, and with it in their object relationships, in their understanding and mastery of the world. This happens because words as symbols have become available for thought processes and for the performance of functions which are contingent upon secondary process thinking of a certain quality. Although the blind child disadvantages in this area are not on a par with that of the deaf, there is some evidence that lack of vision interferes with the ability to acquire and make use of words as symbols. Many essential elements of these word symbols can be contributed only by sight. For this reason, the concept abstracted by these words have no real meaning for children that are blind from birth. Dark, light, and the whole range covered by words describing colors and so on belonging to this category. No other sense can convey suitable alternative information to clarify this concept and abstractions. It is not difficult then to imagine how many limitations are thus imposed on the mental processes of the blind. Few observations from our nursery for the blind can exemplify some of these problems. For example, Gillian, that was 6 years old, was in the lavatory. "Put the light on, it is dark," he said to the teacher. The teacher was surprised and asked, "What do you mean?" Gillian answered, "You know, it is cold and horrible." Matthew, that was age 4, playing hide and seek in the cupboard, called out, "It is all dark in here." When asked what he meant, he answered, "Well, you know, all cold and rainy." In a still larger group of words, the contribution of sight may not be as fundamental, but nevertheless important enough to render this symbol somewhat insufficient or deficient when compared with the equivalent symbols of the sight. A word is thus a complex presentation, remember, or to put it in another way, there corresponds to the word a complicated associative process into which the elements of visual, acoustic, and kinesthetic origin are enumerated above and entered together. A word, however, acquires its meaning by being linked with an object presentation, at all events, if we restrict ourselves to a consideration of substantives. The object presentation itself is once again a complex of associations made up of the greatest variety of visual, acoustic, tactile, kinesthetic, and other presentations. And that's a quote from Freud from 1891. Whatever ego functions are dependent then on the availability of the right kind of imagery or symbols are thus limited in a proportional degree in the blind. The imagery of the world of sighted people is of necessity in many ways inappropriate for the blind. Nevertheless, it seems that in spite of the absence of the visual contribution to many of these world symbols, alternative compensatory means are finally found by many of them, so that these symbols become useful elements in the performance of the complex mental processes for which these basic units are required. This need not imply that they finally become identical with the same word presentation of the sighted. Experiments on blind adults from birth who have recovered sight in adulthood through certain surgical procedures have shown that they are unable to pick out objects by sight, to recognize or even to name them by sight, even though they know all about them and their names by touch. As John pointed out, at first, the early experiences, he only experiences a mass of color, these blind people that recover sight. But gradually he learned to distinguish shapes. When shown a patch of one color, he will quickly see there is a difference between the patch and its surrounding. What he will not do is to recognize that he has seen that particular shape before, nor will he be able to give it its proper name. For example, one man that went through such a procedure, when shown an orange a week after beginning to see, said that it was gold. When asked what shape is it, he said, "Let me touch it and I will tell you." After doing so, he said that it was an orange. When he looked again at it, he said, "Yes, I can see that it is round." Shown next a blue square, he said it was blue and round. A triangle he also described as round. When the angles were pointed out to him, he said, "Ah, yes, I understand now. One can see how they feel." Let's talk about what is called parroting in terms of language. There is much evidence that support the limitations we are describing by the observation of how they use words indiscriminate that can be observed in many of the blind children. They use words in what is called a parroting fashion, without having a proper understanding of their true and complete meaning. For example, when Janet was 9, she frequently used words such as contradict and nuisance without knowing their meanings, obviously having taken them over from her mother. Matthew, that was 4.5, was washing the stuffed bunny and said that at home in the bath when soap gets into his eyes, it stings. They are delicate, he said, adding, "I wonder what delicate means." Now, Occurrence of this word parroting long before the child grasps the corresponding abstract meaning of the words shows how much longer it takes to the blind to assimilate many of the concepts that are symbolized by the words. Not all words represent the same level of abstraction. Many are more concrete than others. The blind learn the concrete first and more easily than the abstract. Though there exists noticeable individual differences in this respect, in general, the blind children shows a certain tendency to concreteness in the verbalized thoughts and some difficulty in the formation of abstract concepts. Similarly, abstract concepts are very frequently readily concretized. In conclusion, these limitations help to explain why in many cases the blind children are not able to master and fully understand the world outside. Large areas of it remain sources of intense fear and anxiety. Nevertheless, at some point of development, some of these limitations seem to disappear or are reduced significantly to a minimum that is compatible with performance on the ego side more similar to the level of performance of the sighted. We have no doubt concerning the usefulness of the closer study of how, when, and through what means the ego find alternative and compensatory ways that finally, to some degree, help overcome these original limitations. Such a study, we believe, will throw abundant light in many developmental processes undergone by the ego, both of the blind and the sighted. It will also clarify and establish the essential elements that must combine to bring about the performance of more complex ego functions. Let's talk now about the superego structure and the question of guilt. The whole question of how the superego structure as a controlling agency develops in the blind deserves a study on its own right. We are limiting ourselves here to highlighting some striking difference between the sighted and the blind. Let's talk about guilt. In the group we study, it is very difficult to find signs of guilt when specific transgressions take place, even at ages when such signs are plentiful in the sighted child. For example, blind children engage freely in a great deal of autoerotic activities and dry gratification corresponding to all sorts of levels, as we already pointed out. These activities are performed openly in the presence of adults. On the whole, they seem to be symptomatic for these children and free of guilt, which is will be very unusual in the case of the sighted child. It is also perhaps important to point to an apparent contradiction in this children's superego development. In the sighted child, the process for internalization of external demands leading to superego precursors and in due course to the final establishment of the superego structure on the conscience is assumed to start when the child's awareness of the importance of the object forces him to give up dry gratification out of concern and fear of the loss of the law of the object. The blind children, in spite of their extreme dependence on their objects, do not seem forced by fear of loss of the object's love when his disapproval is incurred, to internalize prohibitions and commands, or to give up the multiple and primitive forms of autoerotic and drive gratification to which they cling so tenaciously. Let's now take a look at the development of the total personality. Here, there is a marked retardation and unevenness in the development of the total personality, as was shown on the lines of development, and seemed to be the normal picture in this group of blind children. This is in part due to the lack of sight, which implies interference with development in every area, and in part to environmental interferences such as pity and overprotection. We anticipate that the study of the blind in terms of the lines of development of Anna Freud established for sighted children will throw some light to certain aspects of fetal development, especially on the contribution made to that development by the organ and the function of vision. It is also possible that for an independent assessment of the development, we shall have to set up entirely new standards, permitting us to explore the possibility of different interactions between the expression of drive and the severely handicapped ego and superego structures. Let's talk a little bit about regression and fixation points. This is another area where we have become aware of the lack of the fact that the behavior and symptomatic manifestation of sighted children, usually taken as an indication and pointers to the level at which they may be fixated, are not always reliable in the blind. So let's look at mouthing. Thus, for example, we observe intense mouthing in most blind children up to a very late age, which cannot be taken as a sure indication of a fixation at the oral level. Mouthing in the blind, quite apart from the oral drive gratification, must in some of its aspects be considered as an auxiliary exploratory ego function. The same applies to the sense of smell. And of course, it's not easy to distinguish between drive activity and ego activity in this respect. We suggest that we should try to know whether an organ is used by the ego in a limited way to compensate for the lack of vision, as in the exploration of objects through mouthing. And this is important. In this case, the activity will cease when this purpose has been accomplished. Otherwise, it will continue well past the exploratory phase and show an impulsive, instinctual quality of gratification. Now, the blind shows too a significant touching inhibition. And it doesn't have, obviously, the same significance that we would have in terms of the face in the sighted child, There are other many important differences between blind and sighted children with regard to fixation and regression. For example, it's very difficult to establish where face dominance lies in the blind, since light activity remains spread and expressed through all levels of development, and the ego acquiesces in this state of affairs. This picture gets complicated further by the extremely readiness of the blind children to regress temporarily from higher to lower levels of gratification as soon as any significant or not too significant difficulties arise. In fact, the group we observe gives the impression of moving backward and forward far more readily than sighted children would in similar circumstances. On the other hand, it's not quite correct to refer to what we have been describing as fixations proper, since it may well be that the reluctance to give up early forms of gratification is due to the immense and constant frustration that are experienced by these blind children. So the constant shift in functioning from the one level to another with backward and forward move, for example in relation to the external events, tend to support this view. In terms of the dynamic and structural assessment, we need to refer to external conflicts, the internal conflicts, and the internal conflict. As you know, this is a description from Nana Freud's developmental profile, and developmentally, children don't have any conflicts when they are born. They start with the external world. The external conflicts in the mind, in the blind child, owing to the extreme and very prolonged dependence of the blind child on the object. The external type of conflict is perhaps more prominent than it is in the sighted. The blind needs a longer period of time for internalization to take place, and even then they seem to remain to some extent dependent on the approval of the outside world. In terms of the internalized conflicts, as you know, in the interaction with the external world and the conflict with the external world, many of these demands from the object are internalized and become part of the child's own superego unconscious, and these are called the internalized conflicts. Blind children in the age group we studied may show some superego precursors. They have internalized some environmental demands. For example, they may take over from the environment the command to become clean and dry and make it into an internal concern. On the other hand, it has been noted that in blind children it is not easy to come across clear examples of guilt when transgression or other command, or this or other command do occur. Although at the present time we cannot be more specific, there is no doubt that there are important differences between this group of blind and the sighted in the process of internalization, as well and in the ego and superego precursors, as shown by the apparent lack of guilt. On the whole, internalization probably starts latest and takes longer in the blind than in the sighted. In terms of the internal conflict, this refers as such things as the degree of ambivalence that we are born to the fact that bisexuality is a role, and things of that kind. And this is very variable from one human being to the next. But clearly all these innate tendencies are enormously complicated. by these different factors that we have been describing. Now let's talk now about the assessment of some general characteristics. And let's start by frustration tolerance. It is very difficult to evaluate the blind child's reaction to frustration. On the one hand, a great deal of direct gratification occurs all the time, a circumstance that would indicate low frustration tolerance. On the other hand, there is little doubt that in their dealings with the external world, they are constantly exposed to and must tolerate excessive frustrations owing to their blindness and the resultant helplessness. Talking about the sublimation potential, it seems that the tendency to cling to any form of gratification that have been experienced previously, the general tolerance of the ego in this respect and so on, are factors that work against whatever capacity or potential these children may have for sublimation. Moreover, the need for close bodily contact with the objects may further interfere with the blind child's capacity to sublimate or to accept substitute gratifications. These statements are true only up to a given age. Random observations of blind adults seem to point to the fact that at some stage there occur important economic and structural developments and rearrangements in the personality of the blind, partly described under the ego section, which sometimes allow satisfactory sublimations to take place. But in any case, it's not easy to assess this. The overall attitude to anxiety is similarly difficult to assess, and it's an area of special interest on the blind child, as we saw on the day of development, because of the readiness to develop anxiety to a traumatic degree in times of stress. The function of anxiety as a signal is frequently overruled. At such a moment, the children tend to look for very close bodily contact with the object. It seems that up to a comparatively late age, the children's anxiety, as observed in our group of blind children, is aroused mainly by the inability to deal with, understand, and master external dangers and the external world. Progressive developmental forces versus regressive tendencies. In this group of blind children, the material seems to point to a very marked backward pull exerted by the regressive tendencies. We have already mentioned the need to cling to all forms of satisfaction, which doesn't make it easier to take progressive step into new phases. Though progressive tendencies are seen, development on the whole takes at a slower and rather retarded pace. Certain environmental attitudes, such as overprotection and the like, may further obscure the true state of affairs concerning the blind child's potentiality in this area. And with that, I conclude this lecture. It's the Carter-Jenkins Center. It's a non-profit organization. You see what the function is there and where we are located and what the web page address is. And So this is the end. If you have questions, please ask them.